So we, as a city, which some of you may or may not be aware, were European Capital of Culture in 2008. You know, it's a great city, Liverpool, but it's gone through very, very hard times. Capital of Culture, European Capital of Culture was the thing that gave the city its mojo back. You know, it gave it its confidence back, both for its people and the way that kind of the city was physically regenerated. And what we do very well as a city is major outdoor events that bring together people from all sectors, all communities, in a really lovely way, and kind of create great city conversations around culture. And I think when we're talking about networks and how we make sure that we keep talking and we kind of keep creating things, that's hugely important, but not to forget the kind of people that we're serving with these networks in our cities and our towns and across the world. We've got an incredible history as a city, but also in terms of our future, in a kind of, and we are using the word post-Brexit, it's in our panel discussion. In a post-Brexit world, we have to decide as a city what is our kind of calling card, really. You know, how do we still attract people? Tourism for us is a massive, massive deal. You know, it's growing. It's outpacing kind of really any of the other sectors of our economy. It's huge for the city. But music for us, obviously, with the Beatles, but the new music that's coming through with kind of the kind of whole regeneration of the music sector and the UNESCO City of Music title, it's a big deal for us. So our challenge as a city is kind of creating those music networks, reaching out across the world. So yes, the door is opened by the Beatles, but it doesn't shut at them. You know, there's a whole new world out there, there's a whole modern world, and there's a whole future stuff. So I'm really excited about listening today and listening to our brilliant speakers and panellists, and listening to you as well about what the challenges are going to be over the next 5 years. How do we keep the energy that has created these incredible artistic conversations across the world? How do we keep attracting artists, crossing borders, you know, making sure that we create great work that responds to the world that we're living in? And how do we do that as easily and as collaboratively as possible? So I'm going to not keep hopping up and down. I'm going to be listening. So our panellists will introduce each other. And the first person I'd like you to welcome is David Drake.
I'm not going to use my 2 to 4 minutes to do a kind of commercial for Ffotogallery, although we'll talk about some of the things that we're involved in. And I'm going to particularly focus on our sort of network that we initiated that still persists, which is European Prospects. I wanted to first sort of say really that, you know, I'm director of Ffotogallery, which is a national photography agency in Wales. I'm also artistic director of Diffusion, which is a biennial international festival that happens in Cardiff. Next year's edition is the theme is sound and vision. It's much broader than photography and the visual arts. And my job is great. You know, it's creatively fulfilling. It's it's very, very kind of inspiring and satisfying to work internationally. And this year alone, you know, we've got an exhibition on tour that's been to Lyon, then Zaragoza, Glasgow, it's going to Kaunas. I'm collaborating with the Netherlands Photo Museum and a gallery called Field de Calvaire in Paris on our next show, which is a Belgian artist called Katrien de Blauwe. I'm constantly invited to do portfolio reviews and presentations at festivals and events. Last month it was Days of Photography in Horten in Norway. Next week it's Unseen in Amsterdam. I'm quite busy, I'm quite mobile, both within Europe and beyond. And I don't think I would be as in demand if it wasn't for networking and the relationships that I've built up over a number of years, and the organisation has built up as well, that kind of make it possible to do that, to work across borders, to collaborate. And I kind of really want to talk a little bit about that. So in 2010, Ffotogallery as an organisation, me as director, had done a number of bilateral collaborations with the Czech Republic, with Germany, with Lithuania, with Poland, with Italy, etc. And we suddenly realised that actually, you know, the same conversations were coming up over and over again. People felt it was difficult for artists to kind of gain exposure beyond their national boundaries. If you're a small nation like Wales, then you feel somewhat peripheral to London, Paris, kind of Berlin kind of centres, cultural centres. And we kind of all felt we needed to do something about this. So we started meeting at our own expense and talking about how we could be stronger together, to appropriate that terrible expression. And that led to the formation of what became European Prospects, which is, it's a platform and it's also a network. It's not closed, anybody can join it. It's people who share an interest in the role that photography and lens-based media has in representing the idea of a new Europe. So I'll move on to slide number 2. And at the time that we were doing this, there was a lot of optimism about what new Europe might mean, you know, because there are countries that have lived under Soviet occupation for 50 years that were kind of exploring a new identity as part of an enlarged Europe. There was a lot of vibrant kind of collaborations kind of within Europe across borders. So it was an exciting space to be in. And we initially didn't get money from the European Union, but got support from the European Cultural Foundation in Amsterdam, and then we got a culture program kind of grant, so we could actually make real the promise of this network. And we did that in the form of artist residencies and exchanges, co-commissions, curating of exhibitions, etc. And we have an online platform which is still kind of we're adding to all along. And then, of course, that dreadful referendum happened, and the thing that we now call Brexit kind of loomed on the horizon. And to be honest, I became pretty disillusioned, really. Not about collaboration in Europe, but about the whole mechanism of sort of applying for European funding and having to kind of justify what we'd been doing very successfully before we got European funding, and will continue to do successfully without. So I kind of wanted to disengage. Christoph persuaded me otherwise. So I got back into it, and I'm pleased to say that we are one of the Gold Star. We've got a Creative Europe Cooperation Grant for a project called A Woman's Work, which is about the underrepresentation in photography, lens-based media of women and their role in work, and particularly women's role in the technology industries. So that project's about to start. And I think it's about sort of, just to kind of add, it's about an ideological kind of commitment that is much bigger than the political or funding context that surrounds us. And I think what I've learned from my interactions with the network members has given me that confidence and a strength in terms of my ideological position. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
So I'll tell you a bit about what Voluntary Arts is. It's been around for about 30 years, and we represent and sort of lobby on behalf of what would be called the amateur arts sector. Everybody uses slightly different terminology, but it's about kind of community-led voluntary participation in creative activities. So yeah, we've been working on that for nearly 30 years now, and we would claim some sort of success in our work, because if you looked at the landscape back then and look at how the discussions are moving at the moment, there's a real increase in the discussion of kind of creativity rather than the arts, and more inclusive, and kind of thinking about how everybody is creative and having more people participating, not simply as audiences. So we see that at the moment being reflected in an awful lot of policy. So as I said, we've been doing that for a long time, and we feel like there's a great movement. But a few years ago, we would have been thinking, how can this be connected to a wider movement outside of our remit of UK and Ireland? We, like most of you, would have been networking and meeting people. So around, I think, 2006, there was a conference in Cardiff where a lot of these ideas, this is long before my time, I was a child, they started talking about this. So in 2008, there was, in a conference in Ljubljana, was the foundation of a network called Amateo. And we were one of the founder members, along with several others, and I have my Swedish colleague who's here with me. But that was the start of a network, but with no infrastructure. We had a mix of sort of government agencies, charities, kind of NGOs, things like that, but not a lot of money between us. And for nearly 10 years, we sustained this network, and we met regularly. We put on conferences all over Europe on a real sort of shoestring budget. But we kept that going for those 10 years, and the real goal at the end of all this was, could we get funding from the European Union? So we started working on that a couple of years ago. and I met with Christoph and the team here, who are very helpful in supporting us in applying for the networks strand, which I remember Christoph sort of warning me off, saying this is really tough, you should do a cooperation project. But we knew what we were and what we needed was a network, and it fit our needs and our goals better. And the bid went through our Belgian base, so it went in through the Belgian office rather than here. So we were successful, and we were awarded 4 years of funding last year. So our project started August 2017, and we're running till 2021. So we're just at the moment finishing, we've just finished year 1 of a 4-year project, so I'll be able to share and answer any questions on how the teething problems go. But as I said, we're 1/4 of the way through, so we still have a lot to learn too. But we've been running the network for 10 years, and we can see the value in that. So I mentioned briefly sort of some of the things we've done. The idea of our bid for the funding was to build the network, to get more members, to have a network that covered all of Europe. We cover 20-something countries. We've about 30 to 40 members at the moment, but that's growing now quite rapidly. Doing more conferences with proper funding, things like that. Doing a lot more in terms of advocacy and raising the profile. And one of the things we did during this year is we had our first European-wide award. So the award went to this amateur theatre group in the Netherlands who had put on this theatre production involving local residents, but also refugees that had recently moved to this quite a small town in the Netherlands to try and learn more about each other and to integrate through this project. And then we had a sort of 10-year birthday party in Ljubljana in May, and we have a lovely picture of them winning the award. So, some of it is just about giving the profile to the work that's happening, and because it's led by amateurs and voluntary community groups, it doesn't always get a huge amount of exposure. So over these 4 years, we aim to give it that kind of bigger platform. So I think what we're thinking about over these 4 years is how we can get better recognition for what we believe is alongside amateur sport. If you were to add up all of the people across Europe who are participating in creative activities, it would probably be a pretty huge demographic, and we're aiming to undertake some consistent research across Europe for the first time to quantify that and make a stronger case for support for this across Europe and at that level. But thinking about the name of this organization as Creative Europe, it's for us, it makes sense. It's thinking about the creativity of all the people and not thinking of artists and audiences, but all kind of working together to be a more creative society and to help to bridge those cultural divides. We've seen a lot of evidence of how participating together, and you'll know this as well, it's how people learn more about each other and begin to understand different cultures. So I'll be happy to answer more questions on that later. I will introduce our last speaker is Paul Pacifico, who's from AIM, as I know them, the Association of Independent Music.
So we're kind of essentially a trade association, but really we're a kind of community-orientated organisation that brings together a lot of the independent music companies, some of whom are quite large and well-established, some names you might know, like Hospital, Warp, Ninja Tune, Beggars Group, so XL, some quite big artists on those. But then a whole plethora of self-releasing artists, and different kind of participants in the music market. The music market's been through lots of changes recently. So people may have been music publishers or record labels or artists or all sorts of things. And they've kind of come together. And I think the thread that unites everybody from my point of view is this idea of creative entrepreneurship, this sort of nexus of culture and commerce and kind of how we deal with that, particularly in the digital age. And one thing I was thinking about coming along today, thinking about the theme and the topic today around networks, is that actually that experience of creative entrepreneurship can be an extremely lonely one. And I think anyone that's tried to get a project off the ground has had those dark moments of isolation. There are lots of people around you, but you're kind of on your own. And that's an extremely delicate place to be. And particularly when what we do is tied up so much in our passion. It's not just a job. It's never just a job, even when it's commercial. So that's an extraordinary and important thing, I think, to explore. Another thing that I was thinking about on the way here was about when you get started, when you're first starting out, and everyone says, oh, it's about your network. And at that point in time, what that means is it's about networking. It's about getting out there and shoving yourself in front of people, which is kind of really like, God, it's deathly if you're British, isn't it? And it's selling yourself. And then as your career grows and as you get some momentum behind you, you find yourself not networking, but part of a network. And I'm quite interested in that transition. That what is the difference between networking and network? And they're quite different. And I think, again, that's something to be mindful of in this conversation, because the power that you get from actually being part of a network is extraordinary. And whether that's a formalized network through the sorts of structures that Creative Europe helps build, or whether those are informal networks, it's an incredible source of strength, power, and availability of resource. So we're within AIM, the UK companies, but we are then part of a broader European organisation called Impala, which is itself part of a global organisation called WIN. We like our active acronyms. Worldwide Independent Network. Come on, and actually, you know, at every level, there's someone you can talk to. There's something you can reach out for, and I think that sense of mutual support is a source of great power. So that's what I was going to say in terms of opening remarks. Thank you for having me along today. Let's get stuck in.
It's interesting for me because I obviously represent a city, and I think probably 10 years, you know, when austerity hit, our networks as cities shrank because it wasn't the done thing to kind of create these networks. So it's fantastic that voluntary sector organisations and the kind of private sector have carried on building this. I think we're going to need them in the future. But I just want to go just get you all just very briefly to talk a little bit. But, you know, the question is around how are we going to override Brexit, really, and what you're doing about it. In a very, let's be positive about this. You know, let's try and be as positive as we can about it. You must be thinking about that with those brilliant projects all three of you are delivering. Can you just give us a few lines on how you're doing it, then I'll open it up to questions.
Cool, yeah. We think about Brexit incessantly. Of course we do. We obsess about Brexit and the lack of clarity around it. So I think what we have to accept is that we're trying to build certainty in an extremely uncertain situation. And how do you do that? And I think we cope with that by constantly reaffirming our commitment to work with our partners in Europe. So we sit there and we go, whatever happens, we're still going to love each other. And they sit there and they go, whatever happens, we're still, you know, and that I think is fundamentally important at this stage, because nobody knows what's going to happen with visas or touring or passports or the, you know, the shipping works of art around Europe, what's going to happen with digital music, is it a service or a product? Nobody knows. And the more you ask people that should know, the more certain you become that nobody knows. And so it's about how do you build trust in uncertainty? How do you make sure that you maintain those relationships? And it is about relationships. So I think whatever happens, no matter how difficult it becomes, no matter how bureaucratically sort of eviscerating Brexit may or may not be, ultimately, if people on both sides of the channel want to work together, we're gonna keep ourselves together in spite of what comes. And I think that's our approach to it.
Fantastic, Damien, because you're in the middle of a project, aren't you, by the sound of it? You're in year one, so you've got...
So our project funding runs until July 2021, so I can't remember the proposed transition period
next year,
finishes around there, but there might not be a transition period, so it could be next March that the doors shut. It's kind of interesting. I mean, we would definitely be thinking in the same way. So as I said, we've just finished year one, and I've just spent the last 2 days in a meeting with colleagues who've come here to help plan our year two. And we didn't really talk about Brexit much until we got to the end and we were having some lunch and people kind of went, what about Brexit, huh? You know, what's going to happen with that? But in lots of ways, I think we're not worried about it for the same reasons that we started working together because we had common ground, and we've expanded that, and we're fortunate enough to now be getting funding. we already work beyond EU borders, as Creative Europe does, so there's other countries that are part of that. We're optimistic enough to think that that will still be a possibility, whatever the outcome, that will still work. We did kind of joke that we were having the meeting in London this time because they might not be able to come in next year.
Just to London.
Yeah. But we've planned an event in Edinburgh next October is penciled in, so we're hoping everybody will be able to come to Scotland then, and I'm sure there will be a way around that. So all the same reasons, I think that we would find a way to keep working together. It's always going to be possible, and we work internationally as well with contacts in Canada and South America and all sorts. So we think we can sustain that. It will obviously become much more difficult practically to do several things, and we would be hoping that we can continue to apply for funding with Creative Europe, and we've been part of lobbying to keep the UK as a participant in the programme, but obviously there's no assurance on how that will go. But I would say we are thinking seriously about it, and as Voluntary Arts, being a UK and Ireland organisation, we cleverly have re-registered our charity in Dublin, which we had years ago, and then it wasn't really getting any income, so we let it lapse. But we've restarted that in the last couple of years. But obviously not every organisation can legitimately set up a branch. For us, it was always part of our remit, so that's a possibility for us. So we wouldn't be the first people to be funneling money through Dublin.
And do Voluntary Arts... well...
Google.
And do Voluntary Arts play a big leadership role in the network that you're talking about?
Yeah.
So Voluntary Arts UK, and do you think that will change?
Hopefully not. When we were applying, when we were writing the bid, we had a conference in May 2016 in Croatia, and the president of Amateo was a member of Voluntary Arts Board, a Welsh man, and he stood up and he said, "This seems a bit weird for me to be getting up at this point leading this application process on behalf of a network." But this was about a month before the referendum, when nobody thought this was ever going to pass. But it was a very difficult time then, because we were one of the lead partners. We were taking, at the moment, I'm one of 5 kind of team leaders that take additional responsibility. We recruited a coordinator who is also Scottish. Our finance manager from Voluntary Arts is managing the finances for the whole project. So we're, of all the partners, as equal as we would like it to be. We have ownership of more areas of the project than any other organisation. And for the whole 10 years of the network, since it was originally started, we've always been one of the big players in that, and contributing an awful lot and hosting events and giving more capacity, because, you know, a partner in Serbia or Slovenia, whoever it may be, doesn't have the same finances or staffing.
Yeah.
So we've been a big part of that, and I think if we were to be removed from that, it would be really significant, but we hoped that wouldn't happen. And I think we were fortunate that when the referendum happened, nobody turned around and said, right, you're out of
You're not
bid,
leading.
we don't want you in.
Yeah.
And as one of the lead applicants, we were still successful in that time. So
Great. And David, what about you?
Right. Oof. I mean, I guess what my position is perhaps a cultural or countercultural position, because I'm less worried about Brexit as an event as I am about everything that surrounds it, whether that's to do with democracy going out the window, xenophobia and kind of hate crime, you know, the economic kind of fallout, the inhibiting of the prospects, educational and career-wise, of our children, etc., etc. And I think we've got to focus on that, and not focus on, it's going to be more difficult to move artworks across borders. And now, I think the challenges of moving artworks across borders and of kind of collaboration and of movement of people, we can overcome. We've always found ways to do that. Sometimes the ways have been kind of borderline illegal, but there are ways in which we can kind of make things
Just leave that bit
happen.
there.
But I think Brexit can become a state of mind, and I think it's an unhealthy state of mind, and I think it leads to a lot of pessimism and binary kind of thinking about the world that we exist in. And I think we kind of need to somehow look beyond, but be mindful of all of that damage that this kind of unfortunate kind of process is causing to our sector and to the world more generally.
Yeah, that's a really, really interesting debate. I mean, within the AIM community, there are lots of owner-operators, sole trader businesses. It's very difficult to differentiate between the company and the individual, particularly in the case of a self-releasing artist, say, if you're going to perform at a concert and your company is engaged to deliver the performance, but if you don't perform, it's not so great. It's a really tricky situation. Many music businesses as well have a higher than the national average proportion of EU27 workers living in the UK. I think there are two things, and I think you're right to sort of have made the point that you have, building on what David said, because Brexit hasn't happened yet, actually, and yet the number of Europeans I know, continental Europeans, who've moved away from Britain, the number of Brits I know who live in Europe. I mean, I live in Europe. I live on the continent, and I look at Brexit and I think, what am I going to do? I work in London, but I live elsewhere. How's that going to work? What's going to happen to my family? What's going to happen to my kids in school? People on both sides of the Brexit divide are feeling this sort of canyon that is opening and feels to be getting only wider. And it's something that has to be addressed. My hope is that whatever happens with trade, whatever happens with policy around protectionist measures that may be put in place, that citizens of Europe on both sides of the Atlantic are considered on a human level, and that some sensitivity and some common sense is brought to bear. Our lives are too intertwined and have been so for so many decades and centuries, that to allow an artificial political intervention such as Brexit to undo much of that would be catastrophic.
As the Welsh representative on the panel, I think Wales has often felt outside of UK conversations because they tend to be conducted in London by organisations like the Arts Council of England, who doesn't speak on behalf of Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales, etc. And I think, you can sit back and say, this is terrible, this is awful, or you can try and do something about it. And I think it's about making yourself known. I have very good relationships with organisations in Northern Ireland. There's Belfast Exposed, there's Ulster University, and there's a Belfast Photography Festival, and I think I certainly know there's a design week kind of network as well. And so I think it's about being active in those networks, and it's about listening to what people are talking about. So I think if you wait for the Arts Council of Northern Ireland or whatever to take a lead, then you're going to be waiting a long time. I think you're going to have to short circuit that and build your own alliances.
Yeah, and I'll just pick up a little bit on that as well. I mean, city to city, we have a great relationship with Belfast. It's 30 minutes on the plane from us, and there's been traditionally a really great relationship. But I think as we move forward, our relationship with Ireland is going to become, both sides of Ireland is going to become more and more important, and that collaboration between artists, especially with us, because the river links us, and the sea links us. There's lots of kind of ideas about how we collaborate, but also in terms of trade. So for Liverpool, I think we have a significantly higher proportion of students from Northern Ireland than anywhere else. It's massive. So and lots of them stay, they stay there, and conversely the other way around. So I think there's more to do as England with Northern Ireland than perhaps we have done, especially in terms of kind of tourism and student retention and all those different things. Then also how the arts, because sometimes we look very far for our artists to work with us. And actually, I think what we found with, especially around our Tall Ships programme, which is Dublin, Belfast and Liverpool, is the collaboration between those Irish artists and Liverpool artists has been really significant. But I think as a country, we probably need to be thinking much more about how the importance of Northern Ireland. There's a brilliant festival happening at the moment that Sean Duran's running around borders as well, which I think is really interesting. And that concept around borders, I think, will become more and more important over the next couple of years.
Yeah, I had this, I had a dream. I wanted to do a music festival on the Northern Irish border with the Republic on the day of Brexit, and have a stage actually straddling the border, and do it with Love Music, Hate Racism as a protest against, the artificial reimposition of political boundaries against the will of local people. Yeah. Anyone want to fund that?
we can help.
But these are great. These are important things, I think, to do, and we must do something. How many times will we read in the press about the potential for Brexit to catalyse a united Ireland, and think, well, actually, where are we heading with all of this? And I think actually, coming back to the topic of today, networks and the communication between networks and within a network drive the opportunity to actually find solutions for these incredibly complicated and delicate problems. I think it's one of the great strengths in a network is to put a message like that out there, and you just sometimes don't know what's going to come back. Someone somewhere in a node in the network is going to go, "Oh, yeah, I want to do that, or I want to work on that. I can help with that." And suddenly something happens.
But that is another thing, going back to that, Galway is European Capital of Culture in 2020. Lots of things going on there at the moment, but it will come through that, and they're all the same anyway. We know at this point in time, but in 2020 it will deliver an incredible programme. But next year there should be a conversation between cities across Ireland about that. That's a brilliant idea, and Sean Duran is doing some work around that Festival Without Borders. But the relationship kind of with Northern Ireland, Southern Ireland, with the UK as well, and then further out afield to Spain and to others with Galway, I think could be quite an exciting potential. And I'll connect you afterwards with some of the people over there. It'd be great. Does anyone else?
I feel like I should speak as the Irish
Oh,
member
yeah.
of the panel. I grew up in Dublin, so not having the same first-hand experience, but I did grow up in the era of driving hours to see family and having kind of going through the army checks, and it was a very strange experience as a small child to have these people with guns telling you to get out of the car and you were going to visit your grandmother. And it's that sort of thing that so many people grew up with, that there's just, people are terrified of a return to that kind of thing. And you're absolutely right that it was forgotten about, and in the entire Brexit campaign, nobody in England, Scotland and Wales really mentioned it. I was living in Scotland for some of the campaign, lived in London for the rest, and nobody was aware of these issues until it was too late. And it's been really shameful how that's brought that to the fore, that people are completely oblivious to the issues that are unique to Northern Ireland, but in a funny way it's brought them into people's minds. So now suddenly the idea of the Irish border and the needs of Northern Ireland are sort of high on the agenda, and that since sort of the 1980s, most people around Great Britain have kind of forgotten about that. And it's an opportunity now, I think, to sort of state those needs and to try and strengthen those links. I think, again, for us as an organisation, we're disproportionately strong in Northern Ireland. We have a lot of staff there, and it's always been an area where we've had a lot of success, and we work as a sort of a devolved network organisation ourselves, and then connecting our staff across Europe through these. So for us, we find it works quite well. It's definitely possible, and people are really interested in coming from all over Europe to work with our staff in Northern Ireland. So if you can find a way to make the right links with the right people, there is a lot of potential there.
Yeah, I just suddenly thought of something else, because I think if you look at Northern Ireland's position in relation to Europe, you start to get into this nations and regions kind of debate that I was kind of alluding to. And it was no surprise to me, coming from Wales, that our first partners were in Latvia and Czech Republic and Lithuania and Portugal, and rather than Germany, Spain, France, etc. Because and even autonomous regions like the Basque Country, and because there are both cultural similarities and there are also kind of more subtle things about, we kind of know what it's like to feel that we're a small nation on the periphery of things, and we want to do something about that. So I think, as you expand your network, not just in the UK, but in Europe, it's also thinking about, who are the compatible individuals, organisations and places to kind of build your network around.
Inclusivity, diversity, engagement. These are concepts at the very DNA of AIM, and we would be an anathema to our own community if we didn't celebrate strength in diversity. We bring together independent people who are from all over and from wherever and do whatever, and that's great, and that's what makes us strong. We partner with organizations like I mentioned, Love Music, Hate Racism, also She Said So, also Attitude is Everything, a number of organizations from across various interest groups, areas of diversity, inclusivity, to make sure that we represent the best in best practice as we think of it today and as it evolves, because that's something that doesn't stand still. And I think we constantly audit our own approach to these things and our propensity for bias in how we view ourselves and our attitude to diversity. So that's number one. The second thing is being from outside the kind of EU 28 and trying to settle in London is no easy thing. And how we feel trying to go to the US, is about how everyone feels trying to come here. I'm very mindful of that. I'm very mindful of the fact that that's not the experience we want to give our closest neighbours in the 27. And there's a huge amount of improvement to be done in how we engage. But that question around immigration is one of the most delicate conversations in society across the world right now. Immigration in respect to the creative industries, it's even worse, because a lot of what we are in the creative industries comes down to how we identify. Am I an author? I'm writing. Am I an author? A publisher hasn't signed me yet. Am I an author? Same with music. A record company hasn't signed me. Am I an artist? Okay, so a lot of these things come down to self-identity. The other thing that happens is our earnings. The average earnings in the creative industries are below the national average. Indeed, that's replicated across different territories, not just the UK. So when it comes to visas and earnings threshold, £36,000 a year or whatever the current threshold is, I don't know that many jobbing musicians that easily earn over 36 grand a year. Yeah, many of them can be teaching, many of them will be inspirational, many of them are revered amongst communities of musicians, but wouldn't pass those tests. A friend of mine is a guitarist who's probably he's been in the UK for more than 30 years. He renewed his passport. He's from the US originally, and went to get his permanent, right to indefinite leave to remain stamp renewed in his new American passport. And the Home Office came back and asked him to prove that he had been in London in 1991 because they had a gap in the records. And he said, I don't really have any utility bills from 1991. And they said, well, in that case, we're not going to stamp your passport. And he had to take the Home Office to court. Now, yeah, these are serious problems. We, as a network of creative industries or creative people, have to figure out, we have to help government find slightly more creative solutions to these problems. And I think it's through networks. Networks are great tools for validation. Okay, we validate each other through our networks.
And can lobby.
And can lobby.
So just in terms, just to answer the lady's question here, how does she get into these networks? How does she get herself into these networks?
Join. If you're in AIM, come and say hello. Come and join. If you're, and there are networks like ours across every subsector of the creative industries, and then across the creative industries, you have incredible networks now like the Creative Industries Federation, which brings together the whole horizontal world of different creative verticals, and those creative verticals are becoming less and less important with digital media, and we're all crossing over with each other more and more. And my feeling is, if you're looking for networks to join, there is no easier time to find them and join them. And I'd just say, do that. Start there.
Yeah, just to kind of embellish that, because I think there are some, in a sense, kind of industry-specific kind of networks, which I'm not saying they're closed, but there has to be a sort of certain professional standing, or there's kind of rules around kind of. But there are a lot of sort of looser networks, if that's the right. So the What Next groups, which have got 30 kind of cells or chapters, I think they call them, isn't it, around the UK, is kind of, and I go along to the Cardiff one from time to time, and my colleague Esther goes every week at 8:30 in the morning, which is the main obstacle for me. It's quite an early start. There's a thing called Creative Mornings, which I think started in New York and then in certain cities, and they kind of meet once a month, and they're kind of across the design, arts, music, creative industries patch. There's other initiatives. There's a thing called Creative Cardiff, which the universities have got. So I think you can kind of either just turn up or elect to be part of, or whatever, these networks that are kind of more cross art form, creative industries thing. And I think then you can begin to kind of plug into where the opportunities are and the kind of points of influence are, and not feel so isolated. I mean, the point that you made earlier on about it's quite lonely if you're a small independent kind of producer, but if you're part of a kind of a scene, then it doesn't feel so difficult. So my recommendation would be look for those cross-cutting groupings rather than pushing for admission to a kind of closed or more closed kind of professional network.
Yeah, I think if you think of how the world of work has changed, there is this thing of so many more independent freelance creatives, and those things like creative groups in different cities, like the New York model. A lot of that has arisen from people in the same situation who are feeling lonely and trying to find a way to make those professional connections, and often it is just getting together for coffee in a particular location every week. I think you're absolutely right that there's a lot of sort of talk about diversity, and then there was the recent report, I think it was called Panic. There was an event here a while ago that actually examined the diversity of the creative sector in real depth in terms of social class and ethnicity and everything, and it's pretty awful reading, because for all the talk, the creative industries are not very good and need to do an awful lot more. In terms of advice, I would say London is great, and you wouldn't be the first person to come here and try and make a creative career and struggle. And I think London is very welcoming. It's very expensive and very difficult. It's very competitive, but there are a lot of opportunities. But also, if you're in the UK, there's places like Liverpool, so many big cities, so many of,
For example,
Let's big up Liverpool.
but there's,
I'm here on a recruitment drive, really, as a complete,
But
Great-
I
great
mentioned,
football teams,
I
yeah.
lived in Edinburgh. When I first moved from Ireland to the UK, I lived in Edinburgh, and I got loads of great experience working in what is a really cultural city. They make all of their money through festivals and culture. It's the identity of the city. So there are loads of opportunities in other cities, and often taking that as a first step to then, if you want to build up to something else, the media, the film, music, all these industries are in so many cities in the UK, so there are a lot of opportunities. And then your other kind of question about what we're doing, and again, I'm always very conscious that now I'm a white male on a panel here. But as an organization, and we're a pretty small charity, we did recognize that people talk an awful lot about diversity and don't really do anything about it. If you Google for open conversations, you'll see a report that we published about 2 years ago where we sort of said we had to stop being very kind of, we want to be more diverse, but we don't know how to do it and we don't know who to talk to. And we just sort of bit the bullet and did it, and started at the top rather than the bottom. So we immediately diversified our board of trustees, and that has had a real knock-on effect in terms of when we're recruiting, we're just getting more applicants who are more diverse and recruiting the best candidates and getting a more diverse workforce. So it is a difficult thing, but too many people get bogged down on how difficult it is, and they need to just
rather
sort
than
of
just doing it.
go and do
Yeah,
it. So.
yeah.